All right, everyone. Good morning. All right, let's bring everyone to the front. Chairman Anderson. Gwen.
Mr. Anderson.
That is the sound of inevitability. I've used that before.
Chairman Nia.
All right, who do we have?
Oh, no, what happened?
Oh,
Yeah, I get that.
welcome, Gwen. Commissioner Verma, welcome. And Melissa. All right, Pam.
Good morning. So today we have the third work session on the Forest Glen Montgomery Hills Sector Plan. At the last work session, we had looked at the land use and zoning for the sites that are in the Forest Glen District. We didn't have enough time to cover the Montgomery Hills District nor the Woodside District, so we will be covering those today. The staff report, as you'll notice, then does start with looking at the land use and zoning recommendations for the Montgomery Hills District. This is the sector plan map. It shows three distinct districts, Forest Glen at the top, then Montgomery Hills, then Woodside. And this is taken from the plan. It is the mapping for the different properties that we'll be talking about in the Montgomery Hills District. The first one that the staff report covers is the Seminary Shopping Center.
All right. Now,
It is noted
Seminary Shopping
Seminary Place Shopping
Place
Center.
Shopping Center.
Number 5 on the screen.
Number 5. What are some of the retail outlets so we can all picture this in our mind here?
Right, the
Aldi's.
CVS,
And that
there's
whole
the
complex.
Nothing Bundt Cakes,
Nothing Bundt Cakes.
the Aldi's, a Domino's, a beer wine.
Okay, so it's
outlet
that whole complex behind the car wash, behind the
behind the
Shell
Shell
station.
gas station.
I'll never forget the Nothing Bundt Cakes. Thanks to Director Wright.
Yeah. They
are
were good.
memorable.
They
Neither
were
will
good.
my belt.
You got a new notch on your belt? All right.
So the recommendation, these are the, they're,
By the way, Aldi's, how long, they just signed a 20-year lease or something? Anybody know details about that?
Something like that.
I don't,
Really?
Yeah, we don't know the exact term of their lease, but they are quite new, and from what I understand, they seem to be doing good
Quite well.
business.
Yeah.
So I think they're there for a while.
Yeah.
correct.
Reality check. The shopping center's full at this point, right?
Close to full, there may be
Close to full.
one vacant.
Maybe one vacant.
Storefront there.
Yeah, but, okay.
And there are two properties that make up that site.
Yeah.
So when we think about that shopping center, there are actually two properties. And then when thinking about the overall site as a whole, planning staff have included the gas station and the car wash, and thinking about what could happen under a redevelopment scenario and what zoning makes sense for these properties combined. You'll see that on pages 2 and 3 of the staff report. So the recommended zoning is a CRT zone. They are currently in a CRT zone, but with a 2.5 FAR for both commercial and residential and a height of 75 feet. And I,
So wait, sorry, slow down. All right, so the recommended zoning from the master plan is
and it's also on the screen.
75 feet,
On your computer screen in front of you. That would-
2.5, 2.5, 2.5. Okay, and then you just confirm that?
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I just have a quick question here. I know the interest obviously is providing maximum flexibility. And obviously it looks like there's a lot of retail that's going to be here for a while. And so it might be somewhat of a moot point on this particular parcel that we're talking about. But, there's a lot of neighborhood serving retail in these shopping centers that serve a significant need. And I just, from the philosophical standpoint of residential and commercial having the same FAR, could you just explain that and just, what we think in terms of, obviously retail in any environment is tough these days, and I don't think it's going to get any less tough anytime soon, but I'm just personally a little sensitive to the fact that neighborhood serving retail is important and it's tough, and how do we promote that from a policy standpoint without denying flexibility that, is appropriate for this type of plan?
Sure. Again, for the record, Gwen Wright, Planning Director, and I think you make an excellent point. Really, the CR zones were intended to be mixed-use zones, not zones where you would end up with 100% commercial or 100% residential. And we've been somewhat successful in making sure that happens, but there always is a challenge with mixed use and putting the commercial uses on the ground floor of a residential building and making sure those uses get leased. One thing that is suggested later in this memo that I think was a really, really great suggestion by council staff is there is one of the public amenity categories that's support for small businesses. And you can actually get in your public benefit points for an optional method project, points for including and supporting small businesses in your development. So one thing, even for this property, we may want to add is some language saying that that is one of the important benefit point categories to be used in the case of an optional method development on this site.
I appreciate that. I agree. I think that was a really good suggestion, and I'm very supportive of it. And I'm wondering, I just raised the question of whether it would make more sense to include it here or include it for the whole plan, and which place makes the most sense. I'd be comfortable with doing it for the whole plan because I think that much of the redevelopment opportunities that we're talking about have significant amount of neighborhood serving retail, and just having that, not to deny the ability to do what provides highest and best use, but making sure that that is a serious consideration both by the planning board and by the applicants to appreciate that interest and that need, because I would hate for this community to lose some of that retail and then have to go, for traffic issues and for quality of life issues, to then have to go to downtown Silver Spring, for instance, to serve some of the needs that are now being served right in their community.
Yeah, I think that's a very thoughtful way of going about it. There's some other master plans in the past that have tried to impose a requirement that a particular use be retained, and we've seen that can really create a lot of problems. But I think that what you're suggesting is very constructive.
Sounds good. Well, I would propose that we do it for the full plan.
Thank you. So to continue on the point, I think that makes sense. But presently, we have a requirement of mixed use. So under here, there is no requirement. So someone could come in and do a senior affordable development
They could.
site without any ground floor retail.
Right, I think what Director Wright's point is, and Councilmember Friedson's recommendation, that if you do add that language, when it comes forward for review for any redevelopment.
Encourage them to claim their benefit points from that category if they can get their benefit points otherwise.
It does
you
fall
force
under
them?
master plan consistency. Are they conforming to the recommendations and requirements of the master plan? It wouldn't be a requirement, but it is a recommendation that be something that is a high priority public benefit point. They won't be required. There could be a great project that comes forward that is all housing, that even the council would want to support there. So this doesn't prevent that flexibility from happening, but in most cases, what the planning board will do is, and planning staff, is they will look at that master plan recommendation for retail being still on that site and try to work with that development community to make sure that that's still there. There's some portion of that property that remains retail.
It gives the staff some leverage to negotiate for that without making it an absolute requirement in cases where it's just not possible.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I'd be comfortable also throughout the plan, and I think it's consistent with that area and the character of the small businesses and the businesses that are there. We want to encourage that, so I have no problem with that either.
All right. Sounds good. Okay, so that's the Seminary Place Shopping Center.
That's the zoning for it. The next is the park and open space recommendation. That's at the bottom of page 3.
So, and then we'll come back to the Shell station and the
Right.
car
Well,
wash.
no, those were all three together. That's the Seminary Place. At the top of page 3, you'll see that the language in the master plan groups those properties together 5 on your screen is the Seminary Place Shopping Center plus the Shell gas station and the car wash. They're all being zoned the same, and the language that talks about what should happen to those properties is all combined.
Okay. And the goal is to combine them somehow,
It
ultimately?
would allow for that assimilation of properties to redevelop together. It doesn't
Property's always
require-
allowed to be assimilated, just,
They don't,
what's the added benefit of zoning them all the same?
Well, I think just as the council staff said, is that if there is an opportunity for them to be assembled, there is, a great opportunity to do a consolidated plan that is completely, well thought out and integrated, and having all the same zoning definitely helps make that happen. I think there might, who knows, there might even be a possibility of 2 of the properties, the Shell gas station and the car wash, to assemble. It might not be that all of them end up assembling, but by having them all be the same zoning, it makes it much easier for that assemblage to take place.
All right.
okay?
All right. I mean, I don't know that it really makes it much easier for assemblage to take place, but by upzoning them, perhaps there's an incentive, but, okay.
Well, I think if properties are zoned differently and then you're trying to combine them, you're having to figure out, where's the density going to be? Are you going to have to transfer density from one part of the site to another? I mean, it gets complicated.
Especially if they're wells.
This makes it much simpler.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so, ready to move on to the Parks and Open Space recommendation. It is a recommendation for Site 5, so those 4 properties together, or 3 properties
Yep.
together. In the staff report, the planning board staff recommends civic green urban park of 1/2 to 1 acre, so 1/2 acre to 1 acre in size. Just for point of context, at a 1 acre park on the 4 properties together would be about 26% of the site. If just the Seminary Shopping Center, just the current retail space without the gas station and the car wash came forward, it's unclear if that requirement would still be placed on just that one property. It would be 30% of that portion of the site. If you were at the 1 acre end of that size park. Staff recommended maybe just saying that the civic green should be no less than 1/2 acre, but I don't feel extremely strongly. I just think that being cognizant of how much of the site we are requesting when we put
Yeah.
recommendations for a park.
No, I think that's really helpful. I appreciate your recommendation there. I think this is a good example of trying to be very realistic about what the private sector is going to do. And, we have a shopping center that is, I think it's I would imagine it's a difficult location as an owner to figure out whether you're willing to take a risk on redevelopment. I mean, you've got an income flowing in. It's a tricky location, and the kind of business that succeeds there in that environment, it takes a long time to kind of filter through what's going to work there and what's not. It's more regional, I presume, than local. I don't know. But so the chance that a property owner is going to take a big gamble, expanding the amount of, for example, retail space there, is, I think it is up in the air. I'll just say that. And so I think we just need to be very cautious about layering in too many barriers to somebody taking a risk on change. And what the community really wants there, I think, is change. And a lot of that is the roadway and how that infrastructure is designed. But then following upon that is the built environment and the kind of the cleanliness and the order of the structures and the quality of the services or amenities that are provided. And I feel like we have to really not focus on drawing the perfect picture on paper, but try to provide a path. So being more open and flexible about how much land, not requiring them to set aside so much of their land, seems to me to make a lot of sense. So I'm good with the staff recommendation here. See what my colleagues are.
Yeah, I'm totally comfortable with the staff recommendation. I just had a kind of clarification question on this. If this is for the full, this is the 3 parcels together
This,
in terms of the park and.
I don't know that it's,
So what I mean, I think having it together and, trying to encourage assemblage is great. I think the question that I have is, if it's not assembled, do we think that it will only be redeveloped if it's assembled? And that's part of the reason why we've set it up this way? Or if not, I guess my question is, how does the board fulfill that master plan recommendation if there is redevelopment in the absence of assemblage?
So there's a whole spectrum of what might happen on this site. It could be a 100% redevelopment with a half-acre park. It could end up being more what we have seen at the Cabin John Shopping Center, if you're familiar with that, where they essentially refreshed the existing shopping center but added some residential on a pad site. So you could imagine, again, this is a possibility.
Set of townhomes or a load.
Right, that maybe the gas station and car wash go away, and there's some residential put in the place of those, but the rest of the shopping center is simply refreshed. If there is any CR application, there's a 10% open space requirement, and, so for example, if a portion of the area redeveloped but the other portion didn't, we would try to work on the design so that wherever they place their 10% open space could be in a location where it could be lined up with future open space when the rest of the site redevelops. So, I think that, again, it's all about flexibility, showing that there's a maximum opportunity to see what the market is going to actually call for on that site.
So you think that the recommendation with no more than a half acre provides maximum flexibility to get the best outcome, no less, excuse me,
Right,
sorry.
right.
But gives the planning staff and planning board the ability to work with the applicant even in the absence of assemblage. That's just what.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think what it does is again, and we will be talking more about other potential park and open spaces, but we certainly got the message from the previous conversations with the PHED committee that little blobs of open space or parks scattered here and there are not as effective as one, larger. And we learned that in Bethesda and Silver Spring, that really tiny pocket parks aren't as effective as consolidating open space.
In fact, just to pause you there, like, we're all talking about how can we go back and solve the problem, essentially, that, was a previous generation's vision of creating open space, because it's unactivated, it's unused.
Right. And this being one of the larger properties with some development potential, I think it's appropriate to have a civic green urban park
Sure.
of no less than half an acre.
Public space, absolutely.
And, but you will see in other recommendations for other parcels that maybe that's not going to be as necessary in some of the other smaller parcels of land.
I think it may bear some clarifying language to address the point that I think a couple of folks are making, that if there's not a redevelopment of the entire site, that we want a consolidated open space. You don't want to, because there are projects that have been developed in the county where there was sort of open space dispersed throughout the parking lot, with little islands with trees, and that's not what we're looking for. But if it turns out to be impracticable to get half an acre because there's a small part of the shopping center developed, then I think what Gwen is saying is right, that you want to make sure that the space is consolidated and it's done in a way that complements a future redevelopment's open space, so that can then, be aggregated into a one usable.
Can we add language that basically says, and will be consolidated to the greatest extent practicable?
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting, is that, to.
Which allows you then to do at the edge of the parcel, the green space so that if the redevelopment of the next property over redevelops, the planning board could strongly recommend that their 10% green space, connect to it, that you then could have
Yeah,
continuous.
that redevelopment of less.
It wouldn't require
less
one
than
or the other.
Entire shopping center should be planned in such a way as to accommodate, the logical integration of the open space or even a park as that proceeds, without assuming that you can get whatever amount of space is the ultimate end goal with whatever redevelops first.
And from a climate and environmental perspective, putting housing in this location where it's walkable to Metro and the Purple Line, and redeveloping so the stormwater is no longer ripping into the streams, but is actually being managed. Those would be huge improvements over the current environment.
Yes.
And so, we want to incentivize change here. In and of itself, change will produce positive benefits from an environmental perspective. So let's not fuss too much about the details. Let's focus on, a path that is a realistic path. So agreed with that. So what would that be then, Pam?
So we could add, basically, we would be retaining this recommendation of no less than a half-acre park if the entire site comes in for redevelopment. If less than the entire site comes in for redevelopment, then it would be important to consolidate any open space so that future redevelopment can take advantage of what already gets placed.
And my question was on the CRT, 10,000 square feet or more, it requires 10% for open space.
Correct.
You did the calculation that a half acre would be about 13%. Is there a way to tie it to the 10% rather than the acreage? So, for example, could you say, since the zone requires no less than 10% of open space, I'm just trying to even squeeze out that extra 3% of flexibility, depending on the size of the proposed redevelopment. Is there a way to not say 1/2 acre? I'm just, this is more of a zoning question. Can you tie it to the requirements of the zone? Or, do you see what I'm saying, as opposed to saying 1/2 acre?
I don't think there's any danger that you're not going to get the benefit of at least that minimum 10% by including the language in the plan of saying it has to be, we're shooting for a consolidated park.
I agree with the consolidated
of
park
that
space.
much space. You were actually giving the staff the ability to insist on more than the 10%. I mean, the zoning code requirement would say it cannot be less than 10%. Period, full stop. We couldn't even let them do that if we wanted to, really. But this would allow us to basically get some leverage for a little bit more in order to achieve that.
The consolidation. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. All right.
And I think, again, I want to just emphasize the benefit of this is not, certainly that it is environmental, but it's not just environmental. It's really trying to create a place for the people who may end up living on this site to get outside, to, walk their dog, to sit in the sun, to enjoy the outdoors a little bit, which, again, is a benefit in terms of the quality of place that we're trying to create.
That makes sense. Thank you. So I'm also fine with that recommendation.
All right. Great, let's keep going.
Okay, we move to page 4 of the staff report. We move into the Montgomery Hills Shopping Center, which on the screen is site number 4. And it has current zoning that is CRT. It has a maximum density of 2.25. The C is 1.5. The residential is 0.75 and a height of 45 feet. This is its current zoning today. It's being reconfirmed.
This is the one that's in the, was built at the time of the Seminary community, so it has that Tudor design.
Right.
Trying to avoid using a particular word there.
Yes. And it is very
What
old
word is that, Mr. Chairman?
and showing its age. And the zoning on it today
Sure design.
is basically a translation of, I believe it was the C1 zoning that had been there previously. So that translation really, the C1 zone didn't have a density. It was really framed by the height you could get and the setback requirements and the development standards of the C1 zone. There was no density. So when the zoning rewrite occurred, it went through and had a very systematic way of placing density on properties because we were translating them to CRT. And then looked at what were the rules to get commercial density on those sites. And there were some rules
The way
to
we used
get
to do it
housing.
was, we would set setbacks and height, but density was whatever you wanted to
How you
propose,
fill
and then we would figure it out.
Yeah, if you could fit it, you could fit it, as
Pretty
long
good-
as you were.
it's a pretty good
within-
approach. Why do we stop doing that?
We did. So that's what this represents. It represents a translation of the C1 zone that had also some rules about housing that had probably evolved over time as very unique situations in certain parts of the county where the C1 zone was appropriate and somebody wanted housing there. So, it's a little bit of a antiquated look at like what would be appropriate. Staff recommends changing the zoning to at least make the C and the R equivalent to total FAR on that property as well. To get the total zoning, if you left it like this, you'd have to have all the commercial and all the residential. And it's rare that we see someone produce a product that is 1/3 residential. Typically, it's 3/4 residential or some ground floor retail and the rest residential. So it's a little bit odd, that mix. Like I said, it came from the translation. So I would recommend that the zone, it could stay at 2.25, but I would make the C and the R also 2.25. And I would increase the height to 60 feet. It doesn't border any single-family housing and would give them some ability if they did redevelop.
Well, I think this is a key property for remaking the landscape of that area, and the sidewalk issues right adjacent to this parcel are among the worst in the entire area. So I don't know how that interacts with the highway design, the reconfiguration design, but it seems to me we want to really incentivize some change here, and the architectural element here is quite visible in the Seminary Place community up the street, and it will not be lost. It's of a piece. To me, I don't know if it's designed by the same firm or whatever, but anyway, so I don't worry too much about that personally. We have a spectacular Seminary Place community nearby. So in any event, personally, I'm in agreement with the staff recommendation. See where folks are.
Yeah, I would agree as well, and we've already added the small business opportunity, public benefit throughout, so that would be included. The current height there is
45.
45, so you're saying go up to 60.
The zoning is 45. What is the structure?
My guess is if you looked at them,
Probably right about
45.
probably right about there.
Yeah, I would say about 40, yeah.
Yeah.
Peaked roofs. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm fine with the recommendation as well.
All right, we're all good.
The next site that we have in the staff report is the Snyder Superfoods and the Silver Spring Volunteer Fire Station and Parking Lot 12. They're kind of grouped together. I'll take out for right now the Parking Lot 12. We'll wait on that. Is actually Site 1 on the map in front of you. But Site 2 talks about the Snyder Superfood and the Silver Spring Fire Station. We'll do Snyder's first. It's at the top of page 5. The proposed zoning from the planning board is a 1.5 FAR total, the same for commercial, the same for residential, and a 60-foot height. We were contacted by the owners of the Snyder grocery store requesting additional zoning density on this site and additional height. When we took the tour, we stood in the parking lot and we had a conversation about the WMATA easement that runs under it that does make it difficult to do much
was the
development
issue.
on the eastern portion of that site. So recognizing that and the age of the building, council staff recommends that the zoning could be increased to 2.25. Again, that would make it equal to what we just talked about on Montgomery Hills beside it, giving it flexibility for the C and the R. Again, we'd have the language in there about small business, and limited the height to 60 feet. Snyder's does sit higher in elevation than the Montgomery Hills Shopping Center next to it, even though that borders Georgia. We just talked about a 60-foot height there. I think for the Silver Spring Fire Station, it doesn't have any plans for redevelopment. The planning board recommendation on zoning and height are appropriate, and that's being capped at 60. So it seems to me to make sense to leave the Snyder parking lot at 60 feet rather than going up to 75, but increasing its density. to give it some opportunities to redevelop.
Andrew?
Thank you for that. It makes sense, and I do recall, and I'm familiar with the grade change, which I think matters here. But the question that I have, and perhaps this is for planning, but does the density, does the site with the WMATA easement and the other topographical constraints, does it allow for 2.25 FAR density on 60 feet? Because I think we should only zone for something that's possible. I don't think we should zone for something that there's an impact in property value and property taxes, and to not allow it to even be a possible outcome, I don't think is fair to set expectations that way for anybody. So I just want to make sure, as I figure out where I would be on this, of what is possible there, although I do totally appreciate in terms of the grade, particularly the interest in keeping it at 60 versus going to 75.
So we did, again, a quick back of the envelope calculation on this, and we believe that it is possible, and I can sort of walk you through it. The size of the parcel is just under 40,000 square feet. Even if you assume a building footprint would only be able to take up half of that area, 20,000 square feet, because of, open space requirements and easements and access, and so I'm being actually very extreme and saying, let's say it's only able to cover 50%. That would be 20,000 square feet, assuming that you have even 5 levels, which would be under 60 feet. That would be 100,000 square feet, which is more than what is allowed under 2.25 FAR. What's allowed is 89,654 square feet under 2.25 FAR. And so if you had 5 floors or 4.5 floors, let's say, of a 20,000 square foot plate for a building, you could easily accommodate that, and that could be done within 60 feet.
And so just taking that and trying to understand this, the concern then of the height would be you'd have a narrower footprint building that would go higher in order to achieve that density, and we think that's a worse outcome?
No, I mean, I think that at the 60-foot is at a maximum height, it would allow for the narrow building that I just described, a 20,000 square foot building floor plate is probably as small a floor plate as any modern, frankly, residential or commercial building would want to get.
What's the existing floor plate of the?
That I do. I know it's a 15,000, 12 to 15,000.
Got it. Okay.
Something
So
like
I guess here's, that's very important to me, because I wouldn't even consider approving something that I thought couldn't happen, because I think that that's just a bad policy outcome. My sensitivity here continues to be that my interest is to keep Snyder's and to encourage redevelopment. And that is a very hard thing to figure out, a family-owned grocery store that has a tremendous community benefit, and I think including the language in here about the importance of that community benefit and including it in the master plan is really important. My view is providing flexibility to allow that to happen, which is very difficult to me, is more of a concern, the potential to lose a Snyder's, than an additional 10 or 15 feet. And so I'll like to hear from my colleagues, but my inclination is to go with the 75 feet to try to encourage as much as possible with the language in there, the significant community benefit of a family-owned grocery store, a community-serving grocery store, a local grocery store. To me, that's really what I'm, focused on, because I think there is not a single community member who I have talked to who hasn't said, I don't care what you do, but make sure we keep Snyder's, which is a testament to that family and to how much that business means and has meant to that community. So I'd like to give the family that has given a lot, some flexibility to be able to keep the business that's serving the community, and I'm a little less sensitive on the height because, to me, if the height is being used in order to keep the grocery store, keeping Snyder's outweighs, I think, concerns with the height, at least from my perspective. So that's where I would be at.
On the theory that the owner would redevelop and continue to have Snyder's there.
Yeah, I mean, we can't control what happens with redevelopment, even if we don't rezone it and whether or not it stays in. But I think if we provide significant flexibility and strong language that says the significant public benefit of the local grocery store, we get the most likely scenario that that's possible, at least from my perspective. No matter what, it's always going to be a risk, even whether or not we redevelop it. One family, it's not an easy business to run as a family, and so I think providing them with that as much flexibility as possible makes sense.
Will?
I tend to agree with the staff recommendation on the consistent zoning, upzoning, and also with the height, realizing the grade change. I think, look, we've all met with the business owner. I think it was stated earlier how well Aldi's is doing, which has a direct impact on the likelihood of this business staying or not. I think it's likely not to stay, unfortunately, from my read of the situation and conversations with the family. But so that's why I do think we want to have the ability to put, and Director Wright, that was very helpful, laying out that potential opportunity for redevelopment that could provide housing and potentially mix some commercial as well because of the zone. And so I think the height does matter in this instance because it would be just so much taller than the fire station and with the neighboring shopping center. So I think the staff recommendation is the way to go.
Great. The property owner's assertion is that the easements for not only WMATA but also the connecting road that the county wants really reduce. He's having to pull back quite a ways, and so. On that basis, that was the reason for asking for the additional height. The feeling that given the complexity of the site, there is a need to pull back, and so in order to make something possible, additional height would be very useful. Pam, do you feel like there's a connection between what we do here and the ability of Snyder's to remain? I mean, you've put this in the paragraph. I think it's helpful for the record to say that the county council sector plan cannot require a business to remain in operation. I don't think that's something that a lot of people agree with.
This one's difficult. The community, is very tied to this public benefit of having a local family-run grocery store. It's been there forever, and people are very dedicated to it that live in the community. When the property owner comes in and asks for additional density and additional height, and you have a conversation with the property owner, you get the sense that there's a high chance that the reason for this is to redevelop the property. It is not strongly conveyed that it also means keeping the grocery store. It's kind of not talked about, and you kind of can't ask or you can't require because it's just not what we can regulate. I do know that in the transportation discussion at the early planning board draft and in the early discussions, it did have a roadway connection that was basically bifurcating the Snyder property, which definitely would be problematic for redevelopment. But I think where the PHED committee ended up with recommending and talking to Dr. Orland was that that connection could get moved over to the existing Selway lane, that kind of the alley, but make it more of a real connection in between. Yes, that might take part of that property, And it just would remain to be seen whether and how that could happen, because that is also in the
My comments were
location
based on assuming that it's the existing lane that's just getting widened a bit.
Right. So they still have, the existing area where their property, the structure sits. They have a parking lot that's also behind or to the side of them that is,
I mean,
kind of
I just
behind the
would
fire
say
station?
in all the calculations I can do, even if you say you're going to take more than 50% of the current lot for roads, for easements, for this and that, let's say you only allow a 15,000 square foot footprint of a building on that property,
Smaller. Yeah.
which, again, I'm concerned that is not, from a market standpoint, as viable. And a 6-story building, which is allowed under 60 feet of height, gives you 90,000 square feet of developable land, which is still more than the gross floor area allowed under CRT 2.25.
All right, can you explain this again? Okay.
So-
CRT 2.25.
Right, so CRT 2.25, this is on page 5 of your packet,
Yeah.
allows on a property the size of this particular parcel,
Yeah.
allows 89,654 square feet of developable land.
Because this is a formula based on the size of the parcel
Times,
with
you take the
2.25.
parcel size and multiply it by 2.25.
Okay.
And that equals 89,654.
Or roughly 72 units, depending on the size.
Right, depending on the size of the
Important
unit.
also.
If it were all
If
housing.
it were all housing.
So if you, and you can do that in a variety of ways. You could say, oh, well, we're going to cover the whole, let me just round it to 40,000 square feet, the size of the parcel, to make it easy in my explanation. If you're going, we're going to do a 2-story building, and it's going to be the whole parcel. Or you take half the parcel, 20,000 square feet, because the other 20,000 is used for road and easement and other things. You can accommodate the proposed density in 60 feet. Let's say you push it even more and say we're going to have only 15,000 square feet of the parcel available for development. Everything else is going to be road or easement or whatever. Then if you had 6 floors, this is assuming a residential project. 6 floors times 15,000 is still giving you what you,
Still use all the density.
giving you actually more than the density that's available. But I don't think that's the optimal project. The optimal project is, again, going back to a 20,000 square foot plate with a, let's even call it a 20-foot height for a major food use of some sort, because they like taller height. And then 4 floors of residential above it, that's still 60,000, I'm sorry, that's still 60 feet of height, and it's still under,
Okay.
it still is at the amount, in fact, it's over the
So
amount.
there's two
It's over the
two
amount.
conclusions I draw from that. A, if you wanted to use 75 feet, you would have to add more density. But B, the property owner didn't ask for more density, property owner asked for more height, so,
Or have a really skinny building.
or have a really skinny building. So the property owner either did the math wrong or something, correct?
Again, I don't know where the property owner's recommendation came from.
I want to use the name Mr. Snyder, because Snyder's his beloved, and this is who we're talking to. We're talking to Mr. Snyder here.
But the other thing to keep in mind is there are even times when you can go above the mapped height if you provide a certain amount of affordable housing. And so if this project, again, assume it was a grocery store on that 20,000 square footplate, 20 feet high, 4 levels of housing above that, you might actually be able to even get another floor if you did a high percentage of affordable housing.
But haven't you run out of
So
your density?
There are, I'm sorry, wait, no, but the affordable housing would be allowed even
It's a
to go
bonus,
above the
bonus
density.
density.
What's the high percentage?
Oh, gosh, I don't have,
Sorry, the
what percentage of housing do you have to get that? Does anyone in my team? There's an equation in the zoning code, but it's greater than the
More
12.
height and density is available
If they want.
if they want to.
15% affordable housing.
That's a good waste of land, right?
Yeah.
seems like
So
a-
there are
seems like a pretty good
opportunities
place
to
to
get
live.
additional height, but doing it through provision of additional affordable housing.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to point out the 20-foot aspect, because if we're trying to incentivize, something that requires not 10-foot heights, but 20-foot heights, that we should calculate that in. I'd still be comfortable with 75 feet, but, if colleagues are at 60 feet and feel important, I'm not going to down that.
I mean, again, I'm going to rely on the fact that Mr. Snyder, it seems eager to do something, which is a blessing and a curse. I really take his request at face value, but he did not ask for more density, and staff is pointing out some logistical issues with even using the density that's been allowed. So that's a
I'm fine to go with colleagues here. I made my point.
Yeah.
I'm with Snyder's all day long. So
We're always.
we all love the business, and we all want to keep it if it's possible.
I will point out, just for the record, and also to hopefully make my colleague feel better, under the current zoning, they could do 59, almost 60,000 square feet, right? And if we didn't change anything, if I'm reading the map, reading it right, which if it was all residential would be 48 units. And I think people know by now, when we give up zoning, I always like to require additional affordability, even on non-public sites, which we're not doing here, which is, I think, understandable given the easement issues and everything else. So if that makes my colleagues feel better, I think it's a good deal for Mr. Snyder. And he can still stay. We want you to stay if you can stay. Director Wright just laid out the math. That was conservative. You might be able to use even more than that 20,000.
Yeah,
likely.
You definitely can.
Yeah. So
There's more available.
And we would be very, very happy to talk to Mr. Snyder and his design team if they actually want to sit down and start playing with different options of how this could redevelop, how this could move forward. We're absolutely thrilled and available to do that.
All right. So we've got,
I'm fine. 3
all right, 3-0.
Okay, great.
Exactly.
So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Silver Spring Volunteer Fire Station has been recommended for the 1.5 CRT with 1.5 FAR, C of 1.5, R of 1.5, and a height of 60, and staff supports that planning board recommendation. There was a Parks and Open Space recommendation for the fire station and Snyder's sites together. It's not clear, again, whether that recommendation would be applied if one of them came forward or both of them came forward. The recommendation was for a quarter-acre pocket green urban park.
Question for you. What are the implications of providing additional height and density to the fire station, knowing that they have no plan to redevelop? What does that do?
So I have basically been on the state tax assessment website recently, trying to actually get a better handle on when and how do they consider things like changes in zoning. And when they make a change to your assessment, it's based on other sale prices for comparable properties.
Really?
For non-residential, it's the income stream, but this is a public good. They're already CRT. I doubt.
Just pause there. They don't look at the underlying zoning. I mean, I'm sure it's
Right.
relevant, but they figure that shows up in the price.
Exactly. So they're not just saying, oh, you had a zoning change, therefore let's change your assessment.
They rely on the market to demonstrate the value.
So like properties get considered, and usually, so what we really see is when we go from a residential assessment to a commercial assessment.
Well, the
So-
market has to respond to show a change in value. I think this is a
It
very
may-
generally applicable point, because
Right. And where I think where we talk about this, where I think it does have some relevance, is when we go from residential zoning to commercial zoning. Because then your comps are going to be commercially zoned and
Sure.
commercially improved, and that will
Right.
be different than your residential.
Right.
When you are already a commercial mixed-use property, they're still going to be considering other like properties for your assessment.
Okay, but then, having said that, they would, if the other properties in the sector start to redevelop they might say, oh, it looks like
Well,
the
this
property's more valuable.
particular property is going from residential
this is
to
right.
commercial. It's going from R60 to a CRT zone.
Oh,
But we were also wondering, we honestly don't know the tax status of the Silver Spring volunteer fire folks. It may be a 501c3 or some other tax exempt kind of organization. What it does mean is if they ever, and again, this is a 20, maybe 30-year plan, if they ever decided that they did want to relocate, it actually gives them some value, which is a positive thing.
Sell that property.
Right.
and as a public institution, that's something that, and they could sell their density as well to an adjacent property, right?
Transfer it over.
All right, so I'm fine with staff, yeah?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I mean, nonprofits pay property taxes. They just don't pay income taxes. So I just want to clarify that. It does have an implication to the property tax. The question is whether the long-term value, I mean, there are circumstances where volunteer fire companies, doesn't happen all the time, but it happens all the generations, every 30, 50 years, where there's a situation for a volunteer fire company. It's very difficult, particularly in this day and age, where how expensive it is to build a firehouse, and I think the county council knows a thing or two about how expensive firehouses are to build, and to raise that amount of money from private donations is virtually impossible. And so maximizing the value of a property in some form of land swap is generally how these projects get done, or doing some type of mixed use joint venture. In other places, it's been a little bit more rare than I would like here. But I think that's the question. It's not it's a short-term tax implication, and I think we need to be honest about the fact that, yes, you're right about how the state does the tax assessments, but nonprofits do pay property taxes, and if they are similarly zoned, now they're zoned as commercial, and the adjacent sites develop, and many other, we hope, if this plan works the way that we all are talking about it, then it is going to have an implication on their property taxes. The question is whether the long-term benefit over the 30-year or so life of this plan helps
what if they
them
say?
more than it hurts them, and I don't know if any of those conversations have happened.
What does the volunteer fire department say?
Fire department folks?
So, Melissa Williams for the record. Initially, the idea was that there would be some sort of assemblage where the fire station would remain, and we'd be able to come up with a development that allowed for the Snyders and some sort of residential development at the top. We then had conversations about the potential of them relocating to someplace else in the plan area. And that did not go as well as we would have liked. We couldn't find a site that provided the size and the location that they needed. And then we had a conversation about their intent to redevelop at that location. And we were told that right now they didn't have any kind of short-term or long-term plans to do anything different other than just improvements to the site and maybe buying some additional equipment. And so that was kind of where it stopped. Once we went through all of those steps, it didn't necessarily move any further than that.
Did they object to having their property rezoned?
They never,
Are they aware of the I mean,
well,
Please follow up with them.
yeah.
we had quite a few conversations with them about the upzoning, and they never once said that they did not want to be upzoned.
Yeah,
Off of their response.
Exactly. I think we can go with the staff recommendation, but let's ask staff, Melissa and Pam together, please talk to them, help them if they don't understand the implications of their changing to a commercial zone, the upsides and the downsides, because it sounds like there really are both.
Yeah, I mean, the other upside is that you can borrow against the value of your property and stay there, and if your property is worth more, you can borrow more from a bank. And so, I mean, it's very complicated. I mean, we're talking about public benefits. There is no greater public benefit than folks who run into fires and go to, major traffic accidents and pull people out of, really dangerous situations to save their lives. So, I would be hopeful that we're not going to do anything that unintentionally has implications that perhaps they weren't thinking of because they were too busy saving people's lives. So, I think.
Darn, you are more public safety than I am now. What are we going to do?
But yeah,
I do wanna note
yeah. Anyway,
that when I was looking at the state tax assessment website, the one thing they did note was that while they calculate the value, that the taxation is really a county and a municipal, property taxation is a county and municipal requirement, and it's your authority. And so in some ways, if in fact you're concerned about the property taxation of somebody like a fire station, I think that is within the county's purview. It is the county authority to determine what property tax rates there are and how.
Do a payment in lieu of taxes agreement.
Whatever. I'm just putting that out there, that actually that's not a state mandate on the
Montgomery Housing Partnership is smiling in the back.
county. So
All right, so we'll try to get a clearer answer from them before full council, but we'll proceed with the council staff's recommendation.
So now we'll move into the park and open space recommendation for those two properties combined. It was for a 1/4 acre pocket green urban park. As I noted at the top of page 6, if Snyder's alone comes forward and planning staff feels they still need to, in redevelopment, push for the 1/4 acre park, that would be about 28% of the Snyder site, 40% of the fire station site, and together it's about 16% of these combined properties, which is, I noticed, 50% greater than the open space requirement for the zone. And this gets back to what Director Wright was saying a little bit ago, and it's important on the larger properties like the Seminary Place Shopping Center to be thoughtful and really get that green open space. These two properties are quite small, and even combined, it still seems to be a big requirement. And we know there are site constraints that maybe weren't made aware to the staff at the time they were thinking about these things, about that easement that runs under the Snyder parking lot. So I would recommend, making park recommendations at other portions of this plan than doing it on these sites.
Yeah, agree with staff. All right.
The next is the parking lot 12 property. This is the parking lot that is right across from basically the Snyders and the Montgomery Hills Shopping Center. It is in the parking lot district. The recommendation for this property is to give it a mixed use from R60 zoning. It would be a CRT of 1 with 1 commercial, 1 residential, and a height of 60 feet. In your memo you received from Councilmember Jawando, he made a recommendation, as this is a public property, to have the zoning for this property be increased to 1.5 to get a little more additional housing out of it. So that is before you. My recommendation kind of looks at also the park recommendation for this. There is a recommendation for a 10th acre size park here, or parklet. So there are many competing uses for this piece of property. One, it's currently a parking lot, and it does actually get used. It may not get used so much during the daytime. It is overflow for Snyder's during the holiday season. Definitely it's full. It is overflow for Montgomery Hills parking, which is very minor in front of those Tudor shops. There is a funeral home that actually sits on Columbia Boulevard that has maybe an 8-space parking lot or 6-space. It's very, very tiny. So Rinaldi's funeral home actually has a lot of funerals that take access to this parking lot. And what I suggest is when the committee decides its recommendation for the SHA property at 16th and Georgia, that then you consider how you want to treat the parking lot 12. Do you want to maybe use it as parking for whatever is decided on that site? Like, it should be a comprehensive conversation about what's happening in other places in this plan before I think a decision on whether it should be housing or a park or parking,
All right. Well,
because it can be somewhat more flexible.
we're gonna take it up today regardless.
Yeah, well, I'm just in reacting to what Ms. Dunn is saying. I don't see why we wouldn't say something in the plan like, it's public land, and of course, the PLD is going to be, looking at what their parking needs are when there's a redevelopment proposal. So maybe the plan should say explicitly that the public parking needs in the vicinity should be considered before any redevelopment, but that probably goes without saying. So I'm not sure.
Given that it's a PLD property,
Yeah.
that goes without saying.
And I'm not saying that we should encourage the PLD to say we must replace the parking one for one, as they ordinarily would do. Certainly not.
Well, I don't know, actually, right?
But I guess what I'm suggesting is, I hear what Pam is saying, and I think there's validity to it, but I'm not sure I'd be quite so concerned about, oh my God, it's going to redevelop and there's no place to park for the funeral home and the other commercial enterprises that are nearby, because the PLD will be thinking about that.
Point on the board. Let's come back, or not on the board, on the table. Let's come back to it in a moment.
So we're gonna, before we,
Oh, yeah, plenty of discussion when we come back to it.
okay, we'll circle back around. But the next group of properties we're gonna look at is the Georgia Avenue, east properties. Which were the combination of properties, they make up Site 7 on the screen here. And these properties have a variety of densities that are being proposed for them. They're all the same height, they're 45 feet.
Are we, what are the boundaries of what we're talking about right now?
The east side of Georgia Avenue, at the beginning of Flora Lane to the north, down to Columbia Boulevard to the
Exactly.
south.
So the Meditation Museum all the way down to
Correct.
the church.
Down to, well, all of them, the whole Georgia Avenue East yes, it's the Meditation Museum, and I think there's like now a church that might be in one of those storefronts next to it, the gas station, then the next gas station, but then that group of buildings where you have the pawn shop, the gold exchange jewelry place,
Oh, yeah. But then
the vape
continuing
shop, yeah.
all the way to the empty lots.
all the way to the parking lot, which is parking lot 48.
Yeah, so they're
Oh, okay.
separating
Stopping at
the
the
east
parking lot.
side into two groups.
Got it.
And the first group stops at the little PLD
At
parking
Dale.
lot.
Okay,
At Columbia, yeah.
got it.
And so these properties were mostly built before, I think, the advent of C1 zoning that was on the property, C1 or C2, that was on the property when we went through the zoning rewrite. They got translated based on the rules that were used during the rewrite. It did make some of them legally non-conforming. And you'll see that on the screen. So planning staff had gone through and said, well, let's pick zoning that matches what's built today. I took a slightly different tact. I think it's similar, but said, let's pick a zone that is close, that covers all of them and that is consistent in case there is some desire for somebody in the future to want to assemble properties for redevelopment.
All
But the
separately
heights
owned.
all remain the
Every
same at
building is
45.
separately owned today?
They're not all separately owned. There's one or two that are owned by one landlord, but if you look at the property tax records, they are almost all of them owned by somebody that doesn't actually occupy them. I think there's one restaurant in them that is run and owned by the same person, but most of them are not owned by the entity that's renting the space,
Normal for
leasing the
commercial
space.
space? I mean,
I think it varies. I think, these are commercial spaces that have existed for a very, very, very long time, and they've had a lot of turnover in the establishments that are there, which I think are under lease agreement. They come in, they come out, they lease the space. I think they're even classified as Class C rental space.
that's where my
Pretty low.
aquarium store is. I go there for that. All right, so we've recommended
Zoning-
45 feet height.
Right, and to 2.5 FAR with the commercial and the residential equal, and again, the language that is a priority to retain small businesses in this location.
Which one are you looking at for? Are you looking at 9517?
I think we're looking at them all together.
Yeah,
Because they're all a little different as far as they proposed.
They are a little different.
Page 9 lays it out well.
right. Or page 8 has so the top part, if you look at your screen where 7A is, where it's been recommended for 2.25, and it has commercial and residential equal for that one property, would be just to extend that for that block from Flora Lane to White Oak Drive, that whole block, rather than just that one property. I'm recommending a zone 2.25 total, commercial, residential, and retains its 45-foot height.
And why 45 feet height on this side of
It's,
60?
it's what exists today, and now for this one property, even though this property does have commercial zoning right behind it, that one little corner, when you get down White Oak through Columbia Boulevard, those have a very small alley behind them, and they border single-family detached houses right behind them. They are really separated from the single-family detached houses by an alley. So that's why the 45 feet in height.
Was that something that was important to the community? I mean,
I don't know what the conversation with the community was.
Yes, there was some concern raised about the potential redevelopment of those properties and the impact on daylight and just visibility. And so we took that into account when we made the initial recommendations.
all right. Any comments here? Yep.
Yeah, thanks. So this is tough because they're pretty site constrained. They're very close to single-family residents. I understand some of the sensitivity here, but I'm also, and I raised this during the bus tour, a little concerned about the east-west challenge that we face and kind of the microcosm that some of the broader conversation in the county becomes, where we're providing significant value and significant redevelopment opportunities for very high-end, potential if redeveloped, but for very high-end amenities on the western side of Georgia Avenue, and not really providing that same level of opportunity on the east side. And I understand that there's differences and there are constraints and there are other challenges, but I am a little bit concerned about the east-west juxtaposition here and providing one set of standards on one side of a main road and a seemingly very different one on the other side of the road, and what the long-term impacts of the community development that's going to create. And if you live on the west side of Georgia Avenue versus the east side, and what type of amenities you have. And certainly I hope that our state highways become skeletons that bring communities together and not oceans that tear them apart. And based on, unfortunately, as we learned late last night, we had another pedestrian fatality on a state road on Rockville Pike, just outside of my district. Another tragedy, and we realize how difficult these issues are. But I think that's all in the same context that we face as we try to make those improvements and have roadways that become things that bind communities together. I am concerned that we're setting up a zoning arrangement that actually creates, very disparate scenario. And there aren't a lot of owner-occupied retail facilities here. That would make me even more sensitive to changes because of the cash flow issues and the financial implications of property taxes and others. And so I just want to raise that, and I think, I'd like to talk through that in that
My question about
context.
this, to your point,
Yeah.
the properties are not that wide. I mean, could you go higher than 45 feet? Generally, is there a reason?
There's a connection between FAR and height. And I want to just reiterate, just as we talked about on Snyder's, let's take on page 9, the first property. The size of the parcel is 10,726 square feet. Let's assume that they decided to redevelop and use that entire property from property line to property line without anything. So that's, again, let's call it 10,000 square feet for ease of math. And let's assume they do a ground floor that's 20 feet and 2 floors above that. So that would be 3 floors, 1 of retail, 2 of residential. 10,000 times 3 is 30,000 square feet. That is more than the gross square footage allowed under CRT 2.25. Same thing if we go farther down to one of the ones that has,
Okay, but does that mean we should allow for
What-
more density, or does
No.
that mean we shouldn't?
well, I think the densities are appropriate. They are consistent with the densities directly across the street on the west side. They are the right kinds of densities for these areas that are near a metro station, but not right on top of a metro station. When we start talking 3 FAR and above, those are densities that are appropriate for metro station areas. I mean, like on top of metro station areas. Those are densities that we see in parts, again, in our central business districts. Historically, they had 3 FAR, 5 FAR, and 7 FAR. Those were the ways our central business districts laid out. So these are like, 3 FAR is like a central business district kind of density. So I would not suggest going higher on the densities. I really think these are the appropriate densities, and they're the appropriate densities for the properties across the street. But I'm just saying you can accommodate what's allowed by these densities within 45 feet.
Right. I mean, I guess I don't quite understand why. I mean, if we're saying we would be happy for them to build to 45 feet, why wouldn't we work back from that and allow as much density as they can use to get to 45 feet? I don't quite understand philosophically this, the rationale behind what you've explained.
So, Councilmember, the
Yeah.
one issue might be that the proximity to the single-family homes and the setback requirement for height in the CRT zone, because they would be confronting, because there is that right-of-way, even though it's an alley between them and the houses behind them, at their property line, they'd have to start at 35 feet and then angle back. So like up at Georgia Avenue, they could be as high as 45. But also given how shallow these properties are,
Well, I think that's the more natural
That's
constraint
gonna
on what's
be a
going to happen
constraint.
here. I
Right.
don't know that anyone's going to build a 6-story, very small footprint building.
right, but they do have to start at 35 feet at that property line because that's the maximum height in the abutting zone for the single-family detached houses.
Right.
So that's why, and given how shallow they are, I mean, they might get to then 45 feet midway through their property and have an extra half a floor then on that top. God bless you, but,
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of agreeing with you in a way, in my mind, saying, yeah, why don't we let things like that govern, rather than saying, well, 3 FAR is just not appropriate for, I don't know, I thought it would be height. Anyway, this is more philosophical.
Oh, we can have another conversation. Actually, WMATA's done a really great study about densities at, appropriate kinds of densities for metro station areas, and we can go through that with you. It's not a hard and fast, law. It's a rule of thumb. And, again, we're going up in most of these to 2.5. That's a pretty significant amount of density. That is not a small FAR.
Okay. All right, well, given the multiple owners of parcels in here, I think we're, frankly, we all need to do a rain dance to envision that something might happen. It's a very complex situation, but how does the highway, the reconfiguration of Georgia Avenue affect the little service road? Is that retained in our vision? No, it's not.
Service road, not the alley, yes.
So if we proceed with the reconfiguration of Georgia Avenue and that service road comes out, will that have a major impact on those properties, or will they be then really incentivized to redevelop? Or, well, it'll be a minor, they'll still have a frontage.
right, my guess is what will happen is the road itself will be transformed into something else, which is probably a sidewalk, green tree panel, it will be.
Not necessarily
It won't be right up against the edge of the right-of-way, where cars will be traveling right in front of the building. But it could incentivize redevelopment. In fact, if there's already construction there, there could be redevelopment in the next 20 years simply by the age of the existing landowners. There's a lot of things that could happen, we just don't know.
All right.
But I think by giving them consistent zoning, just like you talked about across the Georgia Avenue on the Seminary Place Shopping Center, giving those property owners, the gas station, the car wash, and the shopping center consistent zoning, I think there's some argument to be made to give at least these blocks, the Flora Lane to White Oak, those 3 properties together consistent zoning, and then from White Oak down to Columbia Boulevard to give those properties consistent zoning.
All right, I'm fine with staff's recommendation. Everybody, or, yep, all right, Andrew's fine. We're good?
Okay. We turn to
Right.
page 10. You're now going into the Woodside District. And the first property that is in the Woodside District that's noted in the staff report is the Georgia Avenue at Luzerne Avenue and Cedarview Court. This is the 5 properties that are being recommended for missing middle housing.
Okay, can we just clarify here for my benefit? We've talked about this as our desire is for a developer to do missing middle housing, but we are allowing for what kind of housing?
So if, with these types of densities, it'd be recommended for CRN, commercial residential neighborhood, with only residential density and a height of 50 feet. It is
Could be a small apartment building, it
Could
could be
be.
townhouses, or it could be missing middle.
It could be.
Some of that is missing middle. but
Cottage housing,
Could be cottage housing. There's a wide array of possibilities here.
yes.
Okay.
And so staff supports the planning board's vision for this area. It seems appropriate if, the properties are consolidated. Same with the urban park of a quarter acre on that side of Georgia Avenue. It'd be nice to have also a place for people to congregate on the other side of Georgia.
So the only thing that I think, in light of the fact that we didn't make any changes, and I understand the constraints that exist with the other area, I am further concerned, and I'm normally not a person who would say that, we need to keep a surface parking lot and not put housing on it or a park or some other greater public benefit than parking, which I think we should be moving away from. But I am concerned about how realistic it is to have small retail like we're talking about on that strip and have nowhere for them to park. Either they're going to park in the neighborhood or those.
Are we back at the Georgia?
Yeah, I think
Isn't
we,
I actually did skip something, and I'm glad that
I-
Councilmember Freed-
I thought, oh, sorry. I thought parking lot 48,
So I did.
not
skip that,
12,
and I
which is
apologize.
the very small parking lot close to it. I thought you were talking about them together, sorry.
Yeah, and I should have.
I apologize for
I
that,
made,
yeah.
I made a mistake. I went forward.
Yeah, but I did just want to raise that, and again, I
I haven't recommended any change to that zoning on that parking lot.
Right.
I haven't- And I don't think planning did either, that the parking lot 48 just,
Yeah, but to me, and I don't think we need to be overly prescriptive, but I also think that, this is a master plan question of, can you have retail not in a, more dense
you need parking there.
environment without parking, and particularly once you get rid of the service road, which is what we envision and what I think all of us would want in order to have the, an urban state road there that, has safe pedestrian access. But you still, in order for those retailers to survive, you need somewhere, I think, for people to park.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, I use that parking lot. How can I say we don't need it? But what we have done in this proposal, in the staff recommendation, is confirming 10,000 square feet. Thank you, Siri.
It's more
Is,
advanced than Siri.
yeah. Oh. We have confirmed the existing zoning. I mean, I would imagine I don't think the county would just redevelop this parking lot. I think that would not be advisable. I think unless it was replacing the parking.
I mean, there's no recommendation in the plan regarding the parking lot to do anything but reconfirm its existing zoning.
Right, what we're.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there should be language.
Wow. We have a special guest in the
yeah.
house. All right. Welcome, Councilmember Berliner. You are missed.
There's a chair up here to replace me if you need. Here. Yeah. The sun is not coming in the right angle, but I should be in his shadow. But I'm just wondering whether or not there should be some type of language in the master plan to reflect. I mean, ultimately, like with all of the parking lots that we're going to be talking about, we control the outcome here. But I do think, those are county executive-led decisions, which is how the process works. But the council has land use authority, and the time for us to exert our vision for what we expect for the land use, even on public properties, is during this process. And we have a very constrained, older set of retail that we talked about earlier that is going to be, the parking for it that allows it to survive is going to be wiped out based on our interest in solving Georgia Avenue, which is a great thing. But the challenge to that is, where does that leave this strip, and whether or not the zoning then is even appropriate if we have eliminated the parking.
This is owned by the county.
Right.
And it is owned by the parking lot district. So I would venture to say that the possibility is open that a combined property development could happen with neighbors where you might add enough parking, perhaps underground, to replace this, but the county would be loath to
I think we
give up this parking lot.
could certainly add a sentence, because we weren't explicit. We didn't rezone it, but we didn't explicitly in the plan acknowledge that this is an important parking resource that serves the small businesses in the area, and that it should be either retained or replaced so that there is an
We
opportunity.
shouldn't get too fixated on land, but rather, the parking lot district exists
Well,
to
the
balance
parking
parking.
spaces should be retained or replaced.
Well, even that, that's what the parking lot district does. They manage
Yeah,
the
and-
availability of parking.
Remember, during the bike plan, there was language that said, whenever there's consideration of a master plan recommendation for a bikeway, that you should look at parking. And you could do something in this plan that just acknowledges that there are constraints on parking for this retail. And as to all these sites where there's public parking, I guess there's just really a couple, that before any disposition of land is considered by the executive or the county council to move forward with redevelopment, you should study the parking situation as it exists at the time and figure out whether that's
Required.
what's required. But if you want
Bonds
to,
that are related to the
if you want to
parking lots.
highlight that, which I think what.
Yeah, but I think, there's two pieces of that. One, the parking lot district has two jobs. One is to maintain the revenue in the parking lot district to support its goals. And number two is to manage parking spaces that reflect the needs of the community. So I get that will be part of the calculation. I'm only pointing out the fact that if we think this is a need, this is our part of the process, the way that the charter is set up, for us to have some language, whether it's specific to this particular lot or if it's a broader, statement like we did with the small businesses, which is, again, we had, a potential issue. We want the planning board to consider the impact. We want the county executive or any future county executive in the disposition process to think about it. I thought it was important to raise because these businesses literally don't survive without some type of parking, at least for the foreseen future of this plan.
Let it be clear that we recognize that the businesses need parking. Let it be known. Let it go out from the seventh floor. The seventh floor. We are not.
Need a bell or something.
We are not blind or naive to the need for retail parking.
Well, we can work with council staff to add some language to capture this and explicitly note the importance of, this parking resource. If it's ever considered for disposition, the parking for the area should be evaluated in the context of supporting small businesses. And we can come up with some language.
And that might even work as you're crafting that language for the small business. It's consistent with what we did with the small business throughout as well. So let it be shouted from the rafters. Great.
Okay, so I'm very happy that Councilmember Friedson brought this up, because what I do realize that at the top of page 10, there are 3 more shopping areas that are in Montgomery Hills that aren't really discussed in the plan. I guess they weren't noted, quote, as opportunity areas, or and their zoning was simply being reconfirmed. So that is the 3 shopping establishments or sites that are just south of Columbia Boulevard. the one would include the gas station and the site where the Woodside Deli was. The other is across Georgia Avenue where Goldberg's Bagels is. And then another one is a dry cleaners next to, I believe it's the wig shop. So there are some more commercial properties there. Their zoning was being reconfirmed, so they don't have a lot of text in the plan.
They have 1.5, 1.5, so
Yeah.
the emphasis here is on retaining commercial there?
I think council staff is recommending that the residential FAR should be increased to balance it with the commercial FAR.
Just to give them some potential for
flexibility.
redevelopment, a little more housing possibly if they do redevelop.
'Cause why would you tear down a
Well, and
retail
again,
center to build a new retail center?
we don't really see
Yeah, at the same height and density. I mean, it's not gonna do that.
1/3 of housing being placed with commercial to maximize
Right,
somebody's
right,
density.
right.
Right,
So that would just be a minor,
okay,
but I wanted to bring that up, so I'm,
duly noted.
okay. Now we do move to the Woodside District and the properties that are being recommended from the missing middle at Georgia Avenue, at Luzerne and Cedarview Court. And their park recommendation for a quarter-size pocket park there makes sense, and those pieces all seem to work together. So council staff didn't have any issues with that recommendation in the plan.
All right, I mean, is the pocket park like envisioned as part of the missing middle
Community or?
community? Okay, all right,
Okay,
thanks. Sounds good?
okay, so, and now, moving on, we are on page 11, we're at the right-of-way at 16th Street and Georgia Avenue.
All right,
This is where the planning
the
board
big show begins.
recommended that there be a gateway, a significant urban recreational park be located here with the reconfiguration of the 16th Street entryway. We also received the memo from Councilmember Jawando requesting additional density on the site to provide even more housing. You have a table that shows if it remains at R60, it can provide 22 units, and if it gets increased and changes zoning to CRT of 1.5, it can create up to 157 units of multifamily, so the small units.
That's if you did the whole parcel.
The whole part, right. If you took the total site size and multiplied it by 1.5. Now, that doesn't mean, again, as Director Wright was saying, it takes the density and multiplies it by the size of the site. If you give it a certain height, you could locate that housing along the edges of it. It doesn't mean it has to occupy the full coverage of the site. It just provides for
Sorry,
the
say that again?
opportunity. So the changing it to CRT at a 1.5 with a 1.5 residential could yield up to 157 units. And that's based on basically taking the size of the site and multiplying it by that FAR.
Right.
But you've given it, or it's being recommended for a height of 60 feet, so 5 to 6 stories. So if you located those units on a, say, a 6-story structure, it certainly wouldn't take up the whole site. It would take a
How much would it
portion of
take up?
I have to figure that out.
Enough to not be able to put ball fields
Right.
But you can still have a park.
on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the choice is between a ball field park and a smaller park with housing. Also, you have the question of stormwater. So I think that's a real significant issue, the stormwater remediation for Georgia Avenue. Apparently, the state is very eager to have this site be the home of a major stormwater facility. How does that interact with potential housing here?
I'll let planning
It
staff.
makes it more complicated. I don't think even the SHA really knows right now, to be honest. I think they just started looking at this. But I think the bottom line is, if you're going to try to do housing on the site, you're not going to have, I mean, there's going to be space left over, but it's not going to be anywhere near enough to support a ball field or even anything beyond a very small sort of, play area for
Local serving, building not,
Yeah.
well, I don't know. But
Well, I think I just make a few points about this. First is, if you upzone it, we're not going to be able to get it for a park, and they're going to have to sell it at market value. So your upzoning it will increase the market value.
Is that?
I've been talking to Greg Slater about this.
You've been talking to Greg Slater about that?
Yeah, and if we can get this, if you leave the zoning where it is, I feel confident we can get this site like now.
Okay.
I mean, within the next few months to negotiate with them. So that there's a very clear pathway for the Parks Department to negotiate for this as a swap without any cash from our county.
Not a supplemental.
No, there will be no supplemental.
Supply another-
We're not going to be asking for a supplemental to fund the acquisition of this park. Second point I'd make is, as all of you know, you've all been very supportive of the ball field initiative. We do not have land large enough to support new athletic fields in this part of the county. I mean, this is a very unusual opportunity to get a full-size soccer field that we could permit. And I can tell you from experience, because my kids both used to play soccer, that it's extremely difficult to get practice fields in this part of the county. You wind up, my son's team wound up practicing at Hillendale for a couple of years, which is quite a distance to travel from downtown, the area in downtown Silver Spring. The other thing I'd say is we can probably, in fact, I'm told by our staff, we can almost certainly get a small dog park in addition to an athletic field, which is another amenity that we're really eager to find locations for additional dog parks throughout the downtown county. We could probably build a dozen dog parks and still not have enough to meet the demand. We're trying to do that in Bethesda right now. We do have one at Ellsworth, but a small dog park in this location would be ideal because it's kind of an island. It's away from the other houses. We really struggle in the urbanized parts of the county to get far enough away from houses. We all know what happened in Chevy Chase with their dog park experience recently. To get a dog park that's both proximate enough that people can walk to it and have easy access, but far enough away that the neighbors aren't upset because of the barking dogs. So if we really would like to get this park acquired, because we think it would serve a couple of needs that are very difficult to meet in this part of the county. And you've plussed up the housing almost everywhere in this plan, and that's great, and particularly on the public sites, and shrunk down the public spaces, the open spaces, the parks spaces. So I would just ask you let us get this park for a full-size athletic field.
All right, Councilmember Joando, Councilmember Falbo, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate Mr. Anderson's vision here, and I think it's a significant question. The struggling, when we talked about this a little bit last time and kind of punted to this time, obviously I wrote the memo saying that, and I think everyone generally agrees, we need to maximize housing on public sites. We don't have a lot of public sites, and there's a lot of competing priorities, right? And this one in particular is, I think, unique for a number of reasons. I mean, it's literally the definition of transit-oriented development. You've got, obviously, Silver Spring Metro down the road, but in Forest Glen the other way. But this is basically on 2 blocks or so from from a Purple Line stop, right? So it is right there. It's enough space, as council staff mentioned, to have a pretty decent sized park and housing if you located in it. I would assume that, I think I was doing some math, which is always dangerous, but that you could also probably fit the dog park in there as well with the smaller park. You wouldn't get the ball field. But we did some work, and there's at least half a dozen parks or schools with parks within 1 to 2 miles of this area. You got Rosemary Hills, you have Littonsville, you have several others that have fields. So I just think and I agree with you, I understand the balancing need of parks. I just think the opportunity on the table here with public land, realizing that we might have to pay SHA that's a factor if we upzone it, but the opportunity to get anywhere near 157 units, which would be less because we would want to have probably some park, but even if you got 75 in a place that's 2 blocks from a Purple Line spot, when we just passed this COG resolution saying we need all this housing, I don't know how we can walk away with this without trying to consider housing. So, I just want to raise that. I know we're trying to balance things, but the fact that when I looked into that, we had those half a dozen parks. This is literally, to me, the definition of transit-oriented development and the ability to leverage public land for housing. And again, consistent with my letter, maximize affordability for folks at the workforce housing levels and 50% below AMI. So I'm struggling with that, understand the need, but I think we have to try to get something here. It's such a unique opportunity.
Thank you. Well said, Mr.
Hi.
Sorry.
Sorry, the staff. I'm Ho Jung Garland from Montgomery County Park Department. If I may offer some of the thought. I'd like to make sure this, I'd like to state that this particular site is very noisy condition. You know, some of you were in field trip together with us, and compared to other site, I mean, this site is all bound by road. So it's a very noisy condition, which is less desirable for the housing, but much more desirable for the park. You know, park with like noise, dog.
Saying noise, like noise.
Yeah, noise. Yeah. There are a lot of noise going on in this, in this site. So, you know, while we're comparing the better usage of, park versus housing, I'd like to just address that the noisy condition itself is probably less desirable for the housing, but more desirable for the park. And the other thing is in terms of transit-oriented, we've been hearing from the council loud and clear, park need to be also very transit-oriented, transit accessible. So as of right now, staff is, start looking at transit accessible park facility to provide more in an urban location. So this is like, right there, there's bus stop, right there, there's walkable from the shopping center. So in that sense, it's a very critical location for us. And as Casey Anderson said, that, some of the critical size is necessary to provide some of the ball field and other facilities. So I would like to pitch that in.
I appreciate that. So first of all, I completely appreciate and am almost always on the same page with Councilmember Jawando on the need to maximize particularly public lands and maximize housing to meet the crisis that we're in. I think that is almost always where we're at, and we have worked closely together on that along with Chairman Reamer on these issues. I think the question is on this particular site and in this particular plan, whether this is the right place to do that or whether the rare opportunity to be able to have a transit-oriented ball field to provide serious recreational opportunities to folks who rely on public transit, who don't have a car, to allow young people to be able to access it without their parents needing to drive them, for instance. We don't get those back, these opportunities. We will never get a chance to do that ever again. And in this part of the county, in particular, the opportunities where we know there are tremendous needs. You can scarcely find a ball field that is available or a field that is available, particularly on the weekends, for organized games and practices, or frankly even unorganized games and practices. And I think that this area is too great an opportunity to give up. Not to mention that part of the reason why I was comfortable giving up some of the smaller green space recommendations was the idea that this would be a much more significant community benefit. This is something that I think the community that I have heard from, the second most common thing that I have heard from community members, besides we need to keep Snyder's, was about this particular parcel and the opportunity to have accessible ball fields in the community based on the significant need. And so I would hate to see something that folks have really gotten excited about and see the opportunity and see the need to do it. And I think to the point that was made earlier, and to everybody's credit, the planning board's council staff and each of us in our staff, I think we have worked really hard working together to maximize a lot of the housing opportunities on public and on private parcels to try to meet that need. And I think this is one area where we have a rare opportunity that we will never get back in this part of the county to be able to provide recreational opportunities, and particularly for ball fields that are in serious demand and in desperate need, and that the community really feels strong about. So there's no doubt that these are competing interests. These are two significant needs that everybody recognizes, and I think the question is, do we have opportunities in other areas, and have we seized on those opportunities in other areas, even within this plan, to take advantage of one major public need, which is housing, and then will we get another opportunity like this again anywhere close to this community for ball fields? And I think the answer is no, and that we have to seize on it, and that we have to move forward and to do housing and some small park will not fulfill the need specifically for comprehensive space for ball fields that meets that need.
Dun, dun, dun.
Commissioner Verma, do you have any wise thoughts for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about this entire plan, in an ideal world, the economics would work out and, all of this development would happen. But to Chair Anderson's point, I think a park and even a dog park would be a catalyst to support the development that we're envisioning for this area. And so I think if a developer could say, hey, within walking distance, you have this great amenity, I think all of a sudden the parcels we're talking about are in play. So I definitely advocate for that. And I think it's that striking that balance, and then on the heels of maybe getting it in conjunction with other negotiations is definitely something I think we should consider.
This is one that I'm going to wake up at 3 in the morning in 20 years, still thinking about. All right. Well, I'm going to go with the soccer field on this one because I have done things that I think are otherwise. I wasn't. I think we've reached pretty far in a lot of other areas in this plan. I was not contemplating a large potential development at Woodside Park in downtown Silver Spring. We maxed out the HHS site, theoretically anyway, beyond, frankly, the solar system. We've put on the table rezoning single family. So there's a lot going on here. So, I do feel like in this case, the planning process brought the community together around this issue. I think the train left the station in some respect as well. So I have asked the planning board to put our housing goals, forefront. And as we proceed into future plans, just keep in mind that public land, I generally agree with Mr. Juando fervently that public land is our, it's a key ingredient of our overall housing strategy, and we've got to move aggressively on it. And I think we've done that in many instances in this plan, or we're going to do that in many instances. So with a aching heart, I will side with a soccer field scale park rather than a smaller park. And you're welcome, Mr. Anderson. All right. Sure.
I appreciate the debate and the heartfelt and sincere comments by my colleagues. If it could just be noted in the conversation, I'm happy to vote along with you, but I just want the conversation to be noted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Raise the memo.
Look, I think this is a good, I think we ought to talk about it at full council to make everybody feel our pain, if nothing else. But, this is the kind of decision that, we need to talk about how public land is used in this plan overall. So the equities, but this is what makes this job tough, is you're choosing between things that you both want all the time.
Good.
Yeah, and I'll just say, yeah, we should have the conversation, and then also just to underscore the chair's point, I really think going forward when we're back here again for a different plan, let's remember this moment.
Exactly.
No, I agree. Housing is the most important goal.
Thank you. Let's leave it there. Did you want to add anything? Okay.
No, thank you.
All right, so continuing. Back to lot 12 maybe, or do we keep going?
We could go back to lot 12 would be great, because after that, we only have the
Let me
HHS.
keep my lot, please. Let me get my 11 extra spots on
Well, so now that, yes, you've made this decision to what you want to do on the SHA site, then I think it's perfectly appropriate to really, now that you'll have a park that's, I think, 1/10 of a mile from that parking lot.
So we don't need a park there as well. Right.
Correct.
So let's go back. No, we haven't,
I thought we still have to do HHS.
we have not done the HHS site. We'll come back to that.
Going back to the parking lot since we're
Okay.
relatively close.
Trying to follow the bouncing ball. I apologize.
So this is parking lot 12. It was right after the fire station, and it is on page 6. And Councilmember Jowando's recommendation for the 1.5 FAR would get to 33 units on that small property.
All right, so what is the FAR and the height and everything? What do we got?
The FAR would be 1.5 total commercial residential and the height of 60 feet. Now, it does abut two single-family homes, and so there would be some setbacks related to that, but you could probably certainly along Seminary Road there, you'd get up to 60 feet. which is consistent now
35
with
units.
drivers across. And you could get 33 units, it looks like.
And that is, how does that compare?
Oh, I'm
So
sorry.
it's
I'm
a little
looking at
more
the
than,
35.
I'm looking at the wrong property. Pardon me, sorry.
Top of page 7 is.
Yeah, top of page 7.
so it's a boost over the
35
planning board recommendation. I wanted to make a comment here. I support the proposed zoning from the Councilmember Jawando. And the point that, 15% at NPDU rate, 15% at below NPDU rate, 50% or lower. I would love to see, the way that we do the 50% of median or below is likely to be some kind of partnership with a nonprofit, I would imagine, maybe buying down the rent, I don't know. But I can't leave the conversation without commenting on the 16th Street site is, at the time, it is home to some homeless individuals. I guess over the years, whether there are individuals living there has depended. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. And I understand from county staff that they are generally getting services at Progress Place. But there are some who live there. And I think it would be appropriate for us to just recognize their place in the community, and as this property goes forward, or frankly others in the area. I mean, I don't think we have to get overly prescriptive, but it would be nice to have a partnership with a organization that provides permanent supportive housing, or simply is a place that people can live as they get back on their feet.
So
I think it's part of this. It's part of this community, and
it could be
relevant.
appropriate, and with working with planning staff, we could add language in the section where we actually are talking about the SHA site, given that's where we know that this housing need is currently being served outside for these individuals, to talk about the need for the plan area in general to provide, where appropriate and completely possible, this supportive housing.
Which is not, I'm not suggesting
Okay with
we're
that.
creating Progress Place, right? That's not what we're talking about. It's just that there will be a lot of housing accessed by nonprofit organizations, ideally, in this area, because that's what happens with a lot of our MPDUs, or even housing that is at a lower AMI. So, just recognizing that, we see the ongoing need. I would appreciate that. Any comments? Yeah.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, and I actually went out there a couple months ago before the new year and visited that site, and we were passing out around 11 p.m. and spoke with some of the residents of that site at 16th, and we passed out some socks and some toiletries and other things. So I appreciate Councilman Reamer bringing that up, and it is certainly something that, as we're about a couple of days away from the point in time count, where we go out across the county and see how many people are homeless, I think that's appropriate language to include, and that's why I also appreciate my colleagues going along with my overall recommendation to try to get that deeper level of affordability. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, first of all, I was going to mention the count as well. I'll be out, I think in a couple days, or next week. But and I was also out with Bethesda Cares. I think the challenge is for instance, when I was out with Bethesda Cares, and there was a number of homeless residents who we came across and interacted with, we had housing for them, and we were ready and prepared for the housing for them. I think one of the main challenges is not just the availability of the houses; it's the wide variety of wraparound services and challenges that we need in order to do housing first. And we had the big announcement of our major effort and plan as a county to really focus on these issues. Obviously, it's an acute challenge in greater Silver Spring and in Bethesda and Chevy Chase and some of the more urban areas of the county, but it's a countywide significant challenge and something that we need to take seriously. So I appreciate the fact that it was brought up in all of our interests, and Councilmember Glass, who's taken this on as the lead as well for all the work that's been done. I'm happy to also go along with Councilmember Jawando's recommendation here, and I think, we talked about previously, and I just want to make sure that we have the the broader language that we're going to include, on the parking, and we will figure that out on the other side, and so that will be a universal language, and I think for that reason, handling it the way that Councilmember Jawando has suggested here, making sure that we are leading on the public lands as was discussed earlier, makes sense. I'm glad we can work together on that.
All right.
And then the last property of the day in the work session is the Silver Spring Health and Human Services site down on Georgia near Spring Street that is adjacent to the Woodside Urban Park. And the recommendation through the memo from Councilmember Jawando is to increase from the Planning Board's recommended CRN zoning of a 1 FAR to a CRN of 1.5 FAR. And that yields additional housing, it looks like almost 45 additional units.
All right, so that is a 1.5, commercial 0.5, height 40, wait, what? 45 feet?
Height doesn't change, but it's just the.
It was just a recommendation for additional density. It's a
I thought we were talking about additional height at one point.
pretty large site.
We didn't do the height here, just,
It confronts single-family homes
there's homes on that
along
far
two
end.
sides of the,
Wasn't the proposed zoning 60?
Yeah, I thought the proposed zoning is 60.
We're going up in density and down in height.
That doesn't seem right.
no, I didn't think it was down, maybe
I think this is wrong.
okay, let
Or
me,
maybe this is wrong. Maybe it's 60-60.
I thought it was at least staying the
Up
same.
above, up above it says 60-60, and then in the chart it says 45-45, so one of them is wrong.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's 60, I think.
Yeah, it might be.
That's what I remember.
I know we
I
didn't
remember
change it.
60.
No, that's
know,
what,
yeah.
that's what I thought. I think
Yeah.
it's just a clerical.
Yeah.
Oh, it is 60.
I am a
My
confronting
error.
homeowner, and I think it should be at least 60 feet.
At least 60 feet. I mean, honestly, like, it could be 75. There are, I don't recall, you're a confronting homeowner, but there's a park in between you and the site.
There's townhomes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm catty corner to the edge of the building, so
It's my error.
it's in my lap. Yeah.
In the
Okay,
plan,
it comes all the way through the site.
It's just a typo, yeah.
Yeah, I think there was a 7. I think there was supposed to be a 7 where that 4 is. No?
75.
What would you recommend?
Honestly, I think
You were
75
pushing the limit a little bit.
because it's the whole depth of the block. I think
Yeah.
75 right up against First Avenue would be too high, but 75 against Georgia with, I don't know what that would, in terms of how the parking would be arranged or whatever, but if it, and there's the angular plane idea in the zoning code that it would have to come down.
Step down.
Yeah, but I think you've got the full depth of the shallow end of the block to work with, so.
Absolutely, you got plenty of room. But how about the FAR calculations to the whiz kid at the front
Could they
dais?
use
Can they?
that?
What do we have to make the
Siri, or
FAR
do we have the, planning
to?
director?
Look, everybody wants to know who I meant. Oh, that's cute.
Because this is such a large property, again, 114,000 square feet approximately. Under CRN, they can have 171,579 square feet of development. If you did that in, again, a typical stick-built project of 4 to 5 levels, you could absolutely have a footprint of 20,000 square feet and still accommodate this amount of zoning in 60 feet. So I think that
All right, what I'm seeking to ask is, if we wanted to do 75 feet, what would you recommend as the appropriate FAR?
Oh, that I need to go back and give some more thought to. I mean, I think that going above 1.5, again, as far as you are from both metro stations, I would be hesitant to go to 2. I mean, you could go to 2 FAR that would be possible, but I think we'd want to come back.
And this is a county-owned site, so the county will be in control of what is actually proposed.
Well, you could do 2 FAR, then it would not be CRN, right? I think we'd want to go maybe to CRT.
You could still leave it CR.
You could leave it at CRN?
Oh, I don't know how many zoning.
I mean, why wouldn't we maximize the county's flexibility, given that it's a site?
Why don't you allow the planning staff to figure out
Sure.
what this would look like? I mean, what I was envisioning is like a mid-rise
have is
building
45.
that would parallel
It'll
the
seem like a big loop.
Georgia end. It would be like, the depth would be like probably 50 feet with a double-loaded corridor, right? Something 50,
Has to be
60 feet.
65 feet.
Okay,
double loaded.
65 feet deep. That still leaves you more than half the block to come down or have parking or whatever.
Or you might do 10.
45.
Or something that's not.
These crazy people.
But why don't
We could do a quick design study, but, I think maybe the thing to do is to basically say, do what Councilmember Jawanda has recommended, the 1.5 and 60, with the understanding when we come to full council, we could take a look at what 2 FAR and 75 feet might look like.
That's fine. Do that. All right, as long as let's see. We're going to hear from a lot of people, probably. And what puts us in a better place?
Here's what I think. I am totally fine going to 2 FAR and 75 feet. We talked about it on the bus. This was actually the main site that started. I raised the question of why are we being so timid here if we're serious about it, and I raised that issue. Councilmember Joanna took the bull by the horns and had an even more comprehensive view of that, which I really appreciated, and has led to a lot of changes in this plan as a result. I think that, I appreciate that there was some sensitivity, I think, with some resident meetings and some, questions and concerns about the height, but I do think, so I totally appreciate the perspective and why Councilmember Jawano came forward with the exact proposal that he had at 60 feet. My view is this is exactly what we were talking about before, about the need to maximize housing on our sites. I do think that we're in control. I think, if there's any landlord who should be, and builder who should be sensitive to the interests of the community, it's the government that represents that community. We are in total control here of what is appropriate. It does scale up and scale down as it transitions towards the neighborhood. My recollection of this is where the buildings would be built, there's actually townhomes first and then single-family homes, but I could be wrong about that. Aren't there townhomes on?
No, there's single.
Let's ask Casey. He lives
I live across the street. It's all single-family houses. They're generally
across the street.
across the street. The HHS building now is an old elementary school that's set back from the street by probably 40 feet or so. But the parking lot right now for HHS is on the Georgia Avenue side. So if you
Moved it forward.
if you push the building towards Georgia, my thought was 75 feet of height is actually not that bad. I'm sure some of my neighbors will
I mean,
disagree. So.
a block away, you've got the 100.
Yeah, there's a 200-foot building a block from us. So.
Well, and I'm not to interrupt you, Chair Anderson, but if you note also, if you look at on the screen here, number 1 is the HHS site. Just to the north of it is single-family zoning, but it's actually bordered currently by the Methodist Church. So if it was pushed up to Georgia Avenue, it would be, away from single-family housing at least
Perfectly.
on all sides.
75
I'm
and
good with
2.0, and then you guys work on that, and if you think there's something we ought to do a little differently, come back.
Because I think in fairness, it allows the community to come back before full council session and raise
But,
concerns, and it's more transparent if that's the direction that we're heading. I think that we should head there now, and I think they should have a fair opportunity to reach out not only to the 3 of us, but to our 6 colleagues and weigh in before we make a final decision on this.
What
And I
you've
think
done with
that's
the rest of
more
the plan,
reasonable.
I think it's only consistent to try to push it a little. Yeah.
And we'll take a look at whether it should be CRN or CRT, given that it's getting
2
FAR,
2 FAR and
75 feet.
And I'd love
I
to,
would say CRT to start with. I think Andrew has a great point, that we ought to come forward with a full recommendation, and so that the community knows I guess this is the maximal recommendation. I'm not implying that I'm prepared to start walking back from it, but I'm just saying that they'll know what they're getting. to transparency.
And I'll just bring up one benefit to CRT over CRN is that CRN is standard method, and CRT will allow for
Right,
planning
exactly.
board to
We
look
have
at
to
it as
have-
it goes above a 1 FAR. So
We
I
have to
think
have
that
site
CRT
plan.
is a
It was just CRT, it's just maximum flexibility, county on site, the county's in control at the end of the day. So,
And I just will add, I appreciate the doubling
started
up.
with you,
Yeah.
keep on going.
And I'll be interested to see the calculations, I know we can't do them right here, about what that would yield potentially on the site. And obviously this, I just want to confirm and make sure that this would still be consistent with the 15% at 65% of AMI and 15% at 50. And if we're getting significantly more potential housing, which we are here, I might want to revisit that too. So potentially, so I just want
Keep in
to,
mind, this is
I just wanna
likely
flag
to
it
be a
for you.
nonprofit developer.
Yeah, I got
think
it.
Once you get into
got
that
it.
The other thing
30% set aside category, likely to be a nonprofit
yeah,
developer.
sure.
The other thing that we want to emphasize is that with a CRT development, there will be the 10% open space requirement. We'd want to make sure that open space is adjacent to the existing Woodside Park so that it could be consolidated in with the existing park. So if we can just add a sentence to that, that would be helpful too.
So we'll follow up, I appreciate that.
All right, thank you. Did that finish everything? All right, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Good work.
Bigger win than